Mark Kenny is Fairfax Chief Political Correspondent. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Chris.
The pop quiz, I guess it's good television, but not much enlightenment.
Well, look, it's not good for any politician, particularly one who's charged with economic policy, and we've seen this before. For any of them not to be able to name critical aspects of the tax system. Or other economic parameters. You may recall, for example, that Julie Bishop, when she was Shadow Treasurer back during the Rudd years, got into some trouble when she couldn't name the cash rate, the official cash rate of interest at that time.
And Queensland Labor leader Palaszczuk not knowing the GST rate in the recent election.
Well, that's right, although that seemed to have less impact because she is now Premier in one of the most extraordinary electoral results any of us will ever see, I suspect.
So there's hope for Chris Bowen.
Well, there probably is, and I think he'll probably come out of this better than Julie Bishop did, because it really sealed the end of Julie Bishop's time as an economic minister, and she's of course now talked about in very praising terms as a foreign minister, but as an potential economic minister, people always, whenever, for example, they're talking about replacing Joe Hockey, you do not hear Julie Bishop's name mentioned, and the reason you don't is largely because of her unhappy time there, and that started with that very problem. So Bowen, I think, is in for at least some shine has come off his reputation as a result of not being able to name that point at which which we start paying tax on our income. That should have been $18,200 that he should have been able to say, and he wasn't able to say, and he didn't seem particularly keen to announce the next tax bracket as well. And as Alan Jones said, this is the bloke who would be Treasurer, so it didn't look that great.
This is a time when we're heading into what looks like some months of political debate about the future of the budget, not just this year's budget in May, but going out over the coming decades with the release of the intergenerational report and a tax review. How is the government's, if you like, fiscal budget, intergenerational type policies, how is it approaching it differently this year, say, in contrast to last year?
Well, it's trying to approach it much more methodically than it did so last year. It's trying to get the order of things right. The intergenerational report will come out, I'm told, by the Treasurer at the end of this month. I'm also hearing that it might sort of creep into the next month, but probably in early March, let's say. And that will outline the fiscal position, the economic picture for 40 years in advance. Now, of course, projections that far in advance can't be relied on absolutely, but it's going to give us some very important trend lines for the way expenditure is going to go. And it's going to show, for example, that Medicare is going to cost, $1 gazillion, as one of my colleagues put it the other day. And so we're going to... That's all about the government trying to establish what the problem is before providing us with the solution. And that's the important thing.
So it would help say, look, this is why we want to put a co-payment on Medicare, or we want to rein in costs here. This is why, whereas last year it was kind of just announced and without that kind of background explanation.
Well, last year there was a little bit of this, but it just wasn't very well done. You may recall there was the Commission of Audit, and the Commission of Audit, which was itself a controversial thing, seen by Labor as a way of the government effectively getting out of some of its election commitments, and that turned out to be the case, by the way. But the Commission of Audit threw up all of these tough policy choices, including a GP co-payment. It suggested $15, you may recall. The government eventually hit on a $7 co-payment that announced in the budget, but a range of other things as well. So there was some attempt at it last year, but it was pretty ham-fisted. This year the government's learnt a very, very long and painful lesson over the last year, and it's going to want to do a lot more in terms of establishing the nature of the problem and then considering with the community the range of options that could be put forward as solutions before eventually fixing on those solutions. And if it can get that right, if the government can get that right, it has some hope of getting the community to embrace what might be some difficult policy, some short-term pain in the interest of long-term gain.
So last year Labor was able to say, broken promise, we're not supporting this. End of story. Sort of classical small target politics.
Quite reasonable too, you'd have to say, though. So close to the election, which had been so clearly stated, it was a reasonable political position.
And in political terms, a highly successful one, if we judge by the opinion polls. This time around, though, will Labor be able to do that, to just stay small target?
Less and less, I would think, and I think that's probably implicit in your question. And going back to the point about Medicare that you mentioned, if the intergenerational report can show that Medicare is to become unsustainable, then the government's argument about being the best friend Medicare's ever had by making it sustainable with some adjustments starts to look more credible. And that's where this could swing around. So
and if Labor says we don't support that, the government can say, well that's what the report says. What's your plan?
That's right. Yeah. The government can say, if you don't support that, you actually don't support Medicare. You actually don't support Medicare in a way that can be sustainable over a long period. Therefore, you're pretending to support it, but you're not prepared to take the hard policy options that will enable it to stay afloat. And the same can be said for other areas of government expenditure as well. So this is what the government's hoping to do, to try and get people to understand why it's important to bring the budget back into balance, why it's important not to be borrowing $100 million a day, why it's important to have things on a sustainable footing so that you can actually continue to provide them.
If this is a more sensible way of going about it and a more politically savvy way of going about it, there's two questions, though, that come. One, is there enough time for the government to carry this argument before it runs into the next election campaign? And can the Prime Minister have the political will to implement some of these measures or carry these arguments, seeing, one, he's on shaky ground with the electorate, and two, he's on shaky ground with his own backbench?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I think the question of whether there is enough time is an important one because if we assume that these difficult issues are going to be sort of laid out in the intergenerational report, and we assume that's happening in March, and we're already into a budget by May that has to sort of make some of these, give effect to some of these things, then you would think that's just not enough time. And the government has got itself into something of a pickle, which brings us to the other point you make, which is, the political capital the government has now, and particularly this Prime Minister and this Treasurer, is close to zero. I mean, many people inside the government do not expect this pair of senior leaders to actually be there 6 months from now, let alone at the next election. So really, Tony Abbott's and Joe Hockey as well, they're in this very difficult situation of having to try and sell very difficult and complex ideas at the same time as being on borrowed time themselves and having their eye on the poll the whole time. It's
and all the time you have Malcolm Turnbull appearing as he did on Q&A on Monday nights, just saying, this is how you present arguments like this. You have to explain. You don't use three-word slogans. It makes it very difficult for the current leadership team, doesn't it?
Yeah, and look, I think a lot of Liberals would have seen that the other night as for what it was, pretty undisguised sort of job application, as one person described it on Twitter. As much as that may have offended people, it probably has also convinced a number of them that is the way forward. These are complicated ideas, and they need to be explained in a complete way, in a way that people can understand, but in a way that's not simplistic and, as Turnbull said on Q&A, not dumbed down. And Turnbull has shown that he's probably the best advocate in the Parliament, and if the government's going to have any chance of getting these ideas across, it needs to do so with the best salesman.
And Mark, have you had any indication about how Labor might approach this debate? They must be thinking, what happens if Tony Abbott stays Prime Minister? What happens if Malcolm Turnbull takes over? There's this big policy debate. The small target strategy is working very well for us at the moment, but what if? Have you had any indication of how they may be approaching the intergenerational report, the tax review, the budget, etc.?
Well, not really. Although I think that, I think that the way Labor handles it will be critical, because, as you made a point a minute ago, that we're now getting a way into the electoral cycle, and we're getting to that point in the second half of the electoral term when it's no longer good enough for the opposition to simply not be giving any sort of hint of what its alternative policies are. Excuse me. So I think it's highly likely that the Labor Party will come under some pressure to be a bit more extensive, a bit more expansive about what its plans are. But at this stage, it's mostly bravado. They say it doesn't really matter, if the government changes its top person, it's still going to be the same government. But privately, of course, they're very worried about the advent of Malcolm Turnbull, because at the moment Labor's sitting pretty on top of the polls. A change of leadership in the government could see the government recover. That would be the whole point of doing it. It's likely to see the government recover substantially, and that could change the picture.
Okay, Mark Kenny, thanks for that.
Thanks, Chris.